Hi, I'm Marika. So, yeah, as Hugo mentioned, I actually just graduated, so I'm not a student anymore. I just got my degree 6 years later. But yeah, I'm half Japanese, half American. I grew up in the United States in California. Ivan was right, I really can't see a thing. The first year of architecture school, I co-founded a nonprofit called Mass Design Group. And really the point of it is to try to provide architectural services to kind of underserved populations. So that's kind of what we've been working on. So I'm first just going to kind of talk about a couple of issues that I see sort of facing design in Africa. And then I'm going to talk through sort of a case study of a project that I worked on for a few years. So empathic architecture, this I think kind of sounds like one of those sort of trendy architecture titles that doesn't really mean anything. But I think, I'm going to talk through it, and I swear it means it has a meaning. So, where's this going? Yeah. So, the idea of empathic architecture, the word empathy, you might think, so that's sort of, trying to kind of put yourself in someone else's shoes, how do you sort of understand someone else's needs? You might say doesn't most architecture or all architecture try to do that? And I would say probably not, actually. I think historically, if we just look for 1 second, architecture really, I think, was historically kind of more of a tool to manifest power. And that power might have been sort of God or of the state or of a private corporation. But really you see it as kind of this way of kind of showing the power of some kind of corporation or something. And so, what is really the point of architecture and design today? What is it that drives us as architects? What is it that pushes us forward at, in this profession where we basically get paid nothing, we undercut each other all the time for bids, we work 1 million hours a week. I think there's probably two main things that really drive us forward in this profession. And maybe the first one is really basic, to make beautiful things. We want to see these beautiful objects in society. But it goes beyond that. We also, and most architects I think would say this, that we got into the profession because we wanted to figure out how to make society a better place somehow. And so we're always kind of playing between these two poles, this continuum of, on the one hand, the artist, and on the other hand, kind of the engineer or the activist or the politician or what have you. But I think that, one of the most exciting things about the field is that we do have this kind of choice of how far are we going to push this notion of societal benefit? How can we, how far can we push this idea forward? And so I think there's a really important and basic question that we should ask ourselves whenever we start a project, and maybe not even just designers, but anybody. There's no right answer to the question, but the way that you answer it has a profound impact on kind of how you're going to push the project forward. And the question is, who is my client? So the first way you might answer that, and especially all of us architects, I think, is me. So me as the architect, I want to see my projects built. I'm excited about, my craft and my vision, and I answer to myself, and therefore I'm the client. The second way, though, is something probably the most obvious way, the person that pays me. Somebody hires me, they're going to pay me money, I'm going to, design what they tell me to design, I answer to them, and therefore they're my client, But then, a little bit broader is something maybe like some kind of society of users. So say I get by a bank, and the CEO of the bank's the one paying me, but actually there's all these people that work in the bank, so I probably have to somehow consider what they want as well. But then we might pull out even further and say there's something like the broader society, so, that bank building is actually also on a street, and it's in a neighborhood, and there's people that are going to use that bank, and they're going to pass by it, and, then that neighborhood is also within a city, which is within a region, and within a whole country, So how might my project actually start to impact some of those different scales as well, and then we might even pull back even further and say, okay, maybe we're actually going to think about the whole planet, we're going to think about sustainability, we're going to think about global health or global policy. How can one project actually start to have an impact on all of these scales of work? So there's been a lot of kind of discussion recently about this this idea of design thinking, and it's usually paired with this idea of user-centered design. And so the two sides of this discussion, or sometimes this argument even, are basically kind of proponents of it saying, okay, so at the beginning of a project, you're going to go and you're going to ask the user or the client what they want, what their needs are. You're going to kind of put those all together. You're going to take those into account. You're going to design your project, and you're done. So the user is kind of the one leading the charge because whatever the user says, that's what goes. Then you have opponents of this saying kind of, no, actually, the user doesn't always even know what they want. And there's this old adage that, in the early 1900s, if you'd asked the user what they wanted, you would have ended up with a faster horse instead of a Model T Ford. And so you actually can't really ask users what they want because they don't really know. And so the designer is actually the one that's going to be leading like any sort of major project. The problem that I see with both of these kind of sides of this argument is that they fundamentally kind of presuppose that the user and the designer are on two separate sides of an equation. They're on opposite sides of the spectrum, and sort of ne'er shall they meet unless the designer goes to do like a little focus group or something. And so what I'm sort of arguing is that really the kind of situation that we ideally want to get to is one where the designer and the user actually start to converge on one another. They actually start to become more and more the same. And this is really kind of what I meant when I was talking about empathic architecture at the beginning. That the designer is actually taking time to embed themselves within the community that they're designing for, and therefore they know their client because they actually are themselves the client as well. So now I'm just going to tell you a little bit. I'm going to reveal a little bit about my own sort of path to where I got to. So when I was a first year at Harvard 5 years ago, I was pretty frustrated with architecture. I felt like Harvard was really kind of this place where you just went, you learned how to design pretty objects, and that was kind of the end of it. And I really didn't see where I fit in the profession. I didn't feel like I was cut out to be this kind of really auteur architect designing these like broad visions. And I had been talking to a couple friends about this as well, and we were sort of agreed, we were frustrated. A similar time, my friend and colleague went to see Partners in Health, Paul Farmer, speak at World AIDS Day. Their Partners in Health is a large sort of global health, public health nonprofit. And so Paul Farmer is, whenever he presents, he always talks about, oh, we built all these houses, we did all these roads, there's so much infrastructure we're putting in all these countries. And so, he went up to him afterwards and asked him, what architects are you using? Who are you using to design these buildings? And Paul says, no, architects, we don't use architects. I designed the last hospital on a napkin. We don't need architects. And so we're thinking, well, there's a whole school of architects right across the road, that would be so excited to work with you on these projects. And so we developed this relationship with them, and they ended up asking us to come and help on this hospital project in northern Rwanda, a large district hospital of a district of about 400,000 people. And so we show up in Rwanda all of a sudden, are like sort of wet behind the ears, know nothing, architecture students that have never designed a thing really in their lives. And we all of a sudden have to figure out how to design this massive hospital. And, we're working with Partners in Health, the Clinton Foundation, the Ministry of Health, a lot of other local officials. And so pretty much out of sort of desperation and not knowing any better, we decided to set up an office in Rwanda as sort of just a way to try to understand the community. And that initial decision, I think, has actually shaped the way that we have ended up running our organization over these last 5 years, more than almost anything we've ever done. This idea that we really do try to kind of embed ourselves in the community and literally live there on site. So I took time off from school. I moved to Rwanda. We were living on the actual hospitals, the sort of hospital site with the patients, the doctors, and nurses for maybe a couple weeks at a time, trying to just sort of through osmosis learn about, and through meetings, learn about how people were living on this site. And one of the interesting things that I really had no idea about when I first started this project is that apparently tuberculosis is a huge problem still in developing countries. I had no idea. I thought, in the United States, like you think tuberculosis was eradicated 60 years ago. It doesn't really exist anymore. It's like one of those strange diseases that you just talk about in fairy tales. Little did I know, tuberculosis actually at any one time infects about a third of the world population. So like maybe this whole portion of the auditorium and a little bit into there would have tuberculosis right now. And say one person in the audience has multi-drug resistant or extra drug resistant tuberculosis, and they cough while we're in here, then that infected air that that person has breathed out is now wafting all around our auditorium while we're all inhaling this infected air. We're all breathing in, breathing out. And by the time my talk's over and the next talk and the video and we break for lunch, probably a few of us would have contracted multi-drug resistant tuberculosis just by fact of this room that we're sitting in. That is a true design problem because the way that this room was designed is actually impacting how we are interacting with this disease. And so here you can see how tuberculosis is spread through inhalation and not through touch. And so the problem in Rwanda is that the standard kind of clinic design has this sort of double-loaded corridor layout where there's one room on either side of a narrow hallway, and then the narrow hallway in the middle becomes the waiting room for the patients. That's where they're all waiting to see the doctor. And that waiting room becomes a perfect breeding ground for these airborne diseases. And so the simple move that we made at the beginning of this project was to say, okay, we're going to eliminate all the interior hallways. We're going to make all the waiting rooms outdoor covered spaces. We're also going to lift up the roof and to allow more ventilation to be moving through the wards at all times. We use a combination of operable and inoperable or always open windows, clerestory windows at the top to ensure this sort of constant ventilation. And then the other sort of small innovation is that we noticed that all the patients in the wards are always kind of laying, facing each other on one side of a sort of pathway. So, you have sick people basically looking at other sick people day in and day out. And then you have these really small little windows here because of the beds. And so what we did was we sort of decided to flip the wards so that now you have the patients on either side of a half-height conduit wall, which includes all the oxygen and the needs of the patients. And that allows us to have much bigger sort of windows and ventilation on the exterior of the walls of the wards. So here, this is just the beginning of construction. You can see I'm over there in the little white tank top. And we had about 300 workers on site at any time during this construction process, all local workers that would come to the hospital site, even more than we could take on sometimes because it was such a huge sort of job creation device for the area. We had most of the furniture and everything for the project was also done on site by sort of local craftspeople. We built a craft workshop for them. And here's the hospital completed. It actually just had its opening a few months ago in northern Rwanda. Thanks. And you can see this absolutely breathtaking landscape in Rwanda. If anybody has ever the chance to go to Rwanda to see the gorillas, it's really an unbelievable experience. And so you can see that the hospital is sort of nestled into this hillside, and all of the sort of building design is around that hillside. It's designed around a couple of interior courtyards here, you can see. And the signage system also is color-coded so that if you're not literate, if you don't speak the language, you can still kind of get a basic sense of where you're going. So here you can see there's the conduit wall. This is the orange women's ward. These fans here are extra large industrial fans that move air slowly so that you feel it less on your skin, so you don't feel cold. The name of this company is Big Ass Fans. It's the building. So here, this is the blue of the men's ward, and the yellow of the pediatrics ward. And this, you can see how it looks from the exterior, that you can really kind of see in, and there's this interaction between the interior and exterior of the buildings. And then these are kind of the sort of outdoor waiting rooms that we mentioned. We have a lot of kind of plantings and landscape that will start to grow in and make this really more of a lush space in the future. And here again, the outdoor waiting areas. So I think that some of the most exciting parts about this project weren't really just me being able to design these like cool windows and do all this like nice stuff. To really be able to see kind of the ripple effects and the kind of how big can your client be, kind of aspects of this project. So, you know, after this project was completed, the government decided to actually pave the road all the way from the hospital to Kigali, which is about 2.5 hours to the south, which makes it a lot easier for us to get up and down, but also makes it much easier for all of the kind of farmers and all the people that live in that northern part of the country to be able to come down to the city to sell things and then go back up again. It makes it much more connected to the kind of capital city. Also, because of the hospital, they had to put in electricity for the hospital, and so the entire region around there now has electricity as well. So all of those households around there that never had it before now are able to have power. And the tiny little non-existent town by the hospital is now sort of a thriving business district that has a market and sort of has a bar scene, and I watched the World Cup there. It was very cool. So I wanted to tell you guys just one little story before I end. One of the coolest things that we thought when we first got to Rwanda was that there was this volcanic rock. You can see this volcanic range there, which is really beautiful. So there's this local volcanic rock that we thought was so cool we wanted to use it on all the exteriors of the buildings. And so we realized that this is actually a pretty common practice on building. They use this volcanic rock a lot, but they build it like this. You can see there's like all this like really wide white grout there which they paint, and then they also paint the rocks black themselves also, so you can't really even tell what the rock is made out of or anything. And so when it came time to build the exterior walls, we got all the masons and we were like, okay, please build a mock-up of what one of these stone walls is going to look like. And we want them to look really, really tight together, so they're like a jigsaw puzzle, you know, so you can really see the texture of the rock. And so they built the first mock-up. It looked pretty much like this. And so then we're like, no, okay, do another one, another one. They built about a dozen mock-ups. And then finally they did one that looked right. And so we're like, okay, that's the one. Now you're going to do the whole building like that. And so they start on one wall of the building. They are putting up the wall. They go all the way around the building. They get back to the front facade. They realize that they've gotten so much better over the course of doing this building that they don't like their first wall again. And at this point, now they're actually proud of their work. You know, now they're skilled and they're really proud of their craft. They decided to voluntarily redo the first wall on their own time. And so to me, that is really like the most amazing kind of testament to this idea of creating this sort of pride in community and thinking about who is your client, who are you actually going to be affecting with your work. And so this is kind of what their final work looked like. And here I just have a picture of one of the walls of their masonry. So I really want to urge all the designers and the kind of designer hanger-ons and designer hopefuls to try to kind of expand your notion of who's can be your client be. You know, ask yourself on every project, how big can I go on this? You know, how many people can I impact? Because we really have the power to kind of incite change and to literally shape the lives and the landscapes of tomorrow's Africa. And I don't think there could be any more compelling a mission than that. Thanks.